So let's see. Looks like Kyle E. Christ is next. And Kyle writes, while talking with the socialist about owning the millions of lives lost under socialist ruling, he stated capitalism is more deadly and argued that there have been millions more lives lost with wars, World War I, World War II, etc., and fighting over resources to continue fueling their capitalism machine. Something feels off, but I cannot verbalize it. Additionally, they state our goods are still produced with slave labor overseas. How do you respond with the idea that capitalism has more blood on its hands via wars than socialism? First of all, let's talk about the wars. The wars since World War II were all started by socialists. They were socialists invading capitalist countries. North Korea is a socialist communist state, and it invaded South Korea, which was a free capitalist state. North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. The Soviets went into Czechoslovakia, and the Soviets invaded Hungary, and the Soviets invaded Poland, and the Soviets did all of this. The Soviets went into Afghanistan. These are all wars that were started by the socialists. The socialists, by the way, you want to talk about the big one, about World War II, virtually, well, I won't say most of the damage, but certainly the majority of the damage in the European theater was caused between the conflict of the Nazis and the communists. The biggest battles in history, the biggest actual conflict in history was the Eastern Front in World War II. And what do these people have in common? He wants to put war on the door of capitalism. What are the names of the two parties that were having this gigantic slugfest that killed 20 million Russians and 52 million people worldwide? What were they called? One was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the other one was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So I'm going to have to go with the wars and so on, since they were basically the two major combatants and had most of the killing done in wars in World War II, plus everything after World War II was launched by socialists. So I think they're kind of off base there. Furthermore, the socialist revolutions in China and in the Soviet Union, which we've been talking about, the socialist takeover in Germany, in Cambodia, Vietnam, all of them, they're bloodbaths. There are millions and millions of people killed. Millions of them are killed. In the American Revolution, no one was killed. There were no witch hunts afterwards. Nobody was put up against the wall and shot at the end of the American Revolution because they were on the side of the king. It just didn't happen. Happened in the French Revolution because they were kind of proto-socialists. This whole idea of the perfectibility of man is a certain way to get yourself killed. So as far as the wars goes, they're out of their mind. Now let's talk about the economic thing. You cannot deny 100 to 200 million people killed by socialism. And I mean killed, I mean shot in the back of the head. These are not counting the people who developed badly because they didn't have enough nutrition or who died of starvation at an early age. No. The two biggest famines in the history of the world were famines launched by the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China against their own populations. These were the two biggest famines in history, millions, 50 million probably in China, were the result of a all-powerful socialist state declaring war on their own people. So there's 150 million killed there. Now, in terms of whether or not capitalism is killing people, you're going to have to show me where capitalism is killing people. I don't see it. I can tell you one thing that capitalism is doing is feeding a lot of people. I had it right in the tip of my tongue. It'll come back to me in a second here. Norman Borlaug is an American agronomist, and he was the guy who first started playing around with the idea of modifying, breeding strains of wheat that would be able to grow more in dry climates or were more resistant to insects and so on. And Norman Borlaug saved billions. There are billions and billions and billions of people alive today because of the billions of people that Norman saved in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and so on. So they're eating. And anybody could take a look at historical video footage taken in China prior to, let's say, about 2000, where I did a documentary on China. I was doing 2 episodes on China. It was a big series on China, and I had 2 episodes, and one of them was on the Moon Festival. And they went and shot some footage in 1996, I think, and then they went back and shot some more footage in 2000, Norman Borlaug. And you could not cut the two tapes together. It just didn't cut. In the mid 90s, communist China looked like China had looked for thousands of years. There were people living in stone buildings with dirt floors, in Mao jackets, riding bicycles, dirt poor, starving, horrible. 4 years later, as a result of capitalism coming into the Chinese system, they're wearing suits on the corner, driving Mercedes with cell phones. And it happened like that. And their standard of living went through the ceiling. And people who tell you that capitalism is bad, these are the people who talk about how nice it is. At least, well, maybe we're living in stone huts or thatched huts with dirt floors, but at least we're all doing it together. You can go and live in one of those places right now, you miserable lying sack of stuff. No. It's capitalism has brought people out of poverty, and not just in China. Look at India, 1 billion people. 1 billion people. You look at Gandhi, you look at people like Gandhi, you don't see an awful lot of excess food there. And the reason is because prior to capitalism taking root in India, India was ruled by all kinds of different religious superstitions and you want to talk about discrimination. You cannot beat the Indian caste system in terms of just the cruelty of it. There are the Brahmins, and they're at the top of the pyramid, and they get to rule everything. And down at the bottom are the untouchables, and you can't even look at them directly. And you're born into these castes, and you can't do anything about it. So there you go. Capitalism destroyed this. They destroyed it. They simply went in there and said, "Who wants to work for a living?" And they do some very tough jobs over there. But it's better. And as far as this line about slave labor goes. Slave labor are workers who are being forced to work and who are kept by the people who are employing them after they finish the job for the day. I don't think anything out there is being made by slave labor that I'm aware of. People apply the term to conditions in places like China that are horrific, and I'm not trying to minimize those. Sweatshops, for example, are not slave labor. Slave labor is what happened in the Soviet Union. Slave labor is when you have to build a canal from the Baltic to the White Sea, and you take 150,000 lives to do it, and then the canal's not deep enough to take any ships. That's slave labor. The Gulag system was slave labor. All of the prisoners of the National Socialists were slave labor. In China, people making cell phones are not slaves. They're not slave labor. They are. It's a sweatshop. And the conditions are appalling, and I'm not denying that, but it's not slave labor. And the difference is because people are looking for those jobs. They may be miserable jobs building these cell phones, but people are fighting for them. And the reason they're fighting for them, you might want to just tell, Kyle, you might want to just tell your socialist friend, why does the socialist friend actually believe that there are people with machine guns marching them in there? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that people are fighting for these horrible jobs that pay $2 a day and employ you for 10 hours in this sweatshop. They're fighting to have these jobs, killing each other practically, to get the jobs, because even though these jobs are horrible, the most horrible capitalist job is better than what's not out there with the job. Why do you think these people are so lined up to work in these horrible Chinese factories? Because it's better inside than it is outside. It is. And they can, well, how can you say that to people committing suicide? I understand there are people committing suicide. I'm not defending these things. It was like that in the West, but it was like that in the West 200 years ago. By the way, my ancestors, and I mean my great-great-grandparents and further, were mill workers in Lancashire, and I've seen the pictures of those mills. And they're not sweatshops. They're ice shops. It's freezing cold. There's no heating in there. It's just nothing but giant gears that are just ripping people's hands off, and children are cleaning the spindles and all the rest of it. And I'm descended from those people. And I'm proud to be descended from those people. But it's not slave labor. The reason that my family became mill workers and cotton carders, which is a horrible, unbelievably terrible way to live. Just so you know, I've mentioned this a few times on the show, but I'm going to say it again. Most of my two or three generations of my father's ancestors were cotton carders, and a cotton carder is somebody who works in a textile mill. And what a cotton carder does is this: he's given a flat piece of wood, probably about this big, and it's got a leather strap on one side, and he's got another one just like it. And coming out of the other side, the side that doesn't have the strap, are these little steel hooks, tiny little things like the kind of things you brush out a cat with. And a cotton carter would have one of these on each hand with a little leather thing there, and somebody would hand him a wad of basically virgin cotton. And the cotton carter would take this piece of cotton and they would do this. And they would just do this. And what they're doing is the little hooks are straightening the cotton out and they're aligning the fibers and the little seeds are coming out of there and so on. And after, I don't know how much time you did on one of these things, 5 minutes, I don't know, whatever. You're doing it for 10 hours a day for 30 years of your life. This is what you're doing. And when you're finished, you've got a nice little roll of cotton that's clean, and you hand that off to the people. They take it to the spinners and they start to spin it into thread. Then the thread goes into the mills and they start to weave cloth out of it. You can say that's capitalism, and it's true, and it's also true that it's not very nice, but first of all, it improves itself. I don't have to be a cotton carter because my great-great-great-great-grandfather was. I don't have to do it. I'm not stuck in this cycle of ever ongoing poverty like they are in places that don't have capitalism. So they sacrificed so that I didn't have to, and I'm very grateful for that. But more importantly is the reason that people would become cotton carters in a textile mill in Lancashire is because the alternative was worse. The alternative was what my great-great-great-great-grandfathers did, my ancestors of the people who worked in the cotton mills. They were coal miners. And they weren't coal miners in a big old coal mine, which isn't pleasant anyway. They were coal miners where there was so much coal in England that they would have in their backyard. They'd have a coal mine. I remember thinking in the town of Wigan, I wish it was Wigan, where my family's from, that there were something like 5,000 individual coal holes dug into the earth within a 5-mile radius of central downtown, something like that. So when my ancestors went from being when they got the jobs at the textile mill, they were happy. And they were happy because it was an improvement of what was there before the textile mill came along. It's not me saying, hey, this is wonderful, and I just think it's just great that people are coal miners and cotton carters. I'm not saying that at all. I am saying that it is an improvement over the life that existed before. So, no, I don't buy it. I don't buy any of it. People have to eat. People have to stay warm. That's all there is to it. If you don't want to freeze to death, you have to either go out and mine coal, or you have to send somebody you're related to go out and mine coal. And otherwise, we all freeze. And this kind of smug academic sort of, capitalism kills millions of people. Well, no, it doesn't. It's the absence of capitalism that kills millions of people. And while capitalism may provide some harsh environments, in the early stages of capitalism in a country, it improves. And the fact that people are lining up to take those jobs is saying that even at its most primitive, even at its most brutal, even at its most unfair, at its most disgraceful, disgusting, dangerous, all of that, dirty, even then, it's better than what was going on in the rest of the world, because if it wasn't, nobody would have left the farms to come to the cities. You know? If it wasn't better, people weren't doing it because they're not slave labor. It's an insult to call it that. You'll hear people, sometimes you hear academics talking about what they do is slave labor because they have to work for a living.